The fall of democracy, the rise of Neo-Feudalism in the 21st century. The task of a futurist to describe the patterns of what is to come or may come has always been a difficult one. Sometimes predictions of future developments seem difficult to see. The entire rise of the internet and its changes on the global society, more so on the entire global mentality of humans for the first time having the globe in their mental backyard, was something hardly anyone had foreseen. On the other hand, political and social developments had often foreseen by some quite accurately, at least in part, by dedicated people. If you knew where to look, if you were willing to think out of the box, it is quite possible to at least see future trends and overall developments. There are always trends of social and political development, often based on economy, which are actually quite clear. And clearer nowadays, or at least much more accelerated, so I think it is not a too daring experiment trying to foresee a future development. Insofar I've tried to write about the possible scenario for the future of mankind, and that we entered an era where indeed we are more a mankind than just national or even regional states seem to be clear enough, which is a development only a crisis, or shall we say catastrophe of unprecedented proportions could change or revert. Compared to any previous era, humanity at large has today reached an apex of democratic liberties. I think it is not too much to say that in fact our era, the coming centuries and millennia, differ from the past millennia in such a fundamental way as the days of the Stone Age nomadic hunter society differed from the settlers and the agrarian society which followed it. Like that revolution millennia ago brought a fundamental change in every aspect of human culture and human thinking, so the modern industrial age also heralds a fundamental change. It is just that we do not fully understand that essentially nothing will stay the same. The only thing that stays the same is, of course, human nature itself, so we can assume some constants, and even some things we thought dead are coming back. From that perspective, I tried to analyze the development of roughly the last 100 years and try to outline a possible, or to me, very likely development of society at large. One of the fundamental issues of our days is that we understand our own society, our own situation, much less than we think we do. We presume we are so far above the people of the past, and in material terms we are. Also in terms of political and private liberties, of course. We had, with the rise of liberal democracy, seen also a continual rise of prosperity, of productivity, of personal freedom, and for several generations it seemed to be a granted fact that things would, in modern times, continually grow better, always towards more freedom, more productivity, and better technology. The endless growth, that is by and large the basic ideology of the modern era. And how deeply our entire society, especially in terms of economy, but also mentally, is based on this phase in endless growth is something few are really aware of. In fact, it is the legitimacy of our entire liberal and democratic society that the following generation always has more of everything than the generation before. It is that founding myth of every democracy, every capitalist free market, which both have been so far always connected as one indivisible idea. Free market, liberal society and democracy are a triad, having seen as dependent on each other. The myth which created our society was that if we work hard, if we really do our best, it will always get better. We believe, simply said, that we would always find better solutions to our problems than before. That is the idea of modernism, the era of freedom and democracy. What we did not take into account in this perception was that as our society develops socially, economically, and in technology, the complexity of the entire system has begun to be beyond what we can manage and understand. More and more people understand less and less of the very basic concepts of what makes the world tick. Insofar we are in fact falling back into a primitive state. The primitive man of the past did not know science. He knew little about the correlations of cause and effect. If a climate change ruined his rural life, he had no idea why this was so and blamed angry gods or evil witches. The continually rising complexity of the modern world has again led the masses of people into a similar primitive state. If a man loses his job because of some complex economic development, or if a person loses his health due to substances in food, water or air, he is just as helpless and opaque to the reasons and relations behind this. Such fates hit him as they had hit the primitive man. He is a helpless victim of the complexity of modern systems which are beyond his understanding. So it is as if some incomprehensible powers rule his life of which he understands little or nothing. The common man and woman are thus falling back into a primitive state. Everyone who has in some case fallen prey to economy, environment or bureaucracy can tell about this feeling to be helpless sort of overpowerful and incomprehensible systems. This is the basic dilemma of our days, and the most important angle for my analysis, something that we must really understand and acknowledge. Our society is made of three systems: technology, economy, and the social stratifications. The development of technology has been so far mostly in the focus when it came to the idea of future development. And while that certainly plays a part, it is not the dominating feature, at least not in the visible items which futurologists usually love to write about: anti-grav cars, fusion power, spaceflight. While some of these technological artifacts indeed can change society fundamentally, taking as example the clock, the printing press, the car, the telephone or the internet, the tendencies can be summed up in two simple categories. New technologies which changed society have either brought a rise of social connectivity or a new comfort against the dangers posed by nature, preventions against the risks we face as living organisms. All developments like cars, trains, telephones, internet can all be described as communicative or social inventions. They changed our social horizon, they broadened our chances to meet people and exchange ideas with them. We get more mobile, either physically through cars or trains or in a virtual ways like the cell phone and the internet. While the virtual communication like cell phones and internet has made leaps ahead, the physical transportation has been strangely stagnant over the past few decades. The futurists of the past have assumed fantastic concepts of hypermodern mass transportation in whatever imaginable way. Nothing of this has been yet manifested. In fact, the transportation has been one of the most fundamental issues on the technological side. The cities have become crammed full with cars. Traffic has continually risen. More cars drive on our streets every year, and the public transport hardly has replaced private transport. The streets are parked full with cars in every possible side way. The gas prices and the fact that gas and petroleum will someday be gone remain like a looming threat of the era of physical mobility we have created. The fascinating thing about our society is that while humans are quite aware of these technological issues, they remain mostly opaque towards the civilization issues themselves. Modern man takes the civilization with all its comforts and habits as granted as nature, while in fact civilization is anything but granted. There is a certain ungratefulness and ignorance toward the extreme efforts, the suffering and personal investments of past generations had to face to create such a liberal and advanced society. And that is a basic risk. A mass society, unable to see how civilization and culture are not naturally given things, but realities which took much effort to create and to take continual effort to maintain, we face the very real risk to lose it, simply because we do not have the character past generations had. Why this is so is something I will come back to. You have to take it as a theory for the moment. Another angle where the gap between the civilized world around us and our ability to understand and control the world is visible lies in the issue of so-called limited poison values. Ever since the 1980s, our society has begun to face a new question. How much poison is poisonous? With the rise of technology, all sorts of chemical substances were developed and used. Nuclear power plants create cheap electricity, and substances to make food longer tenable are just two examples. In both cases, things started to get out of our hands. Since then, we have an ongoing debate how much of what substance is allowed in our food, our air, our water. The issue is, nobody but an expert can really judge these things. How much of a given chemical in our food is tolerable and where does it begin to harm us? That is something we cannot judge. We must rely in such questions on experts of all sorts. That makes the very idea of a democracy where people decide about their own matter a sort of an absurdity. We fall back into a way of primitives. As the men of the past had to ask an augur or prophet what to do, we have our own augurs and seers, the scientific and economic experts, whose reasonings are unintelligible to us, but as the augurs who read from some sheep innards or tea leaves in the past, or the prophetess who sat at Delphi. We just can't believe the experts or not believe them. And that leads the very premise of a democracy ad absurdum, that we decide of our own matters as enlightened knowing citizens. The same is even more true in the sphere of economy, a sphere usually neglected by futurists. In the 19th century, when the great economic theories of our modern days were formed, they usually were created along the lines of ideology, and ideological dominance in economy is something we haven't really faced, and it exists to this very day. In the 20th century, these ideologies of economy have basically manifested in Keynesianism and neoliberalism. Now, it would lead too far to analyze the presumptions and ideas behind these two at large. Simply said, Keynesianism is mostly the idea that a government oversees and regulates economy and implies a primate of politics over economy. The idea is that economy itself will always lead to a crisis and that governments have to regulate economy to ensure both a balanced welfare and prevent economy from collapse, because the unbound powers of market will always lead to disaster due to the destructive nature of economic egoism. The neoliberal school essentially said the very opposite. For them, the government is the evil participant, and they believe in a sort of invisible hand, a market that would regulate itself by try and error, and the market should have superiority over political interest. The fascinating thing is that both ideologies seem to fail repeatedly in reality. Keynesianism has been the driving idea behind social democracy or democratic socialism. Maggie Thatcher once made the aesthetic but not untrue comment, the problem with socialism is that you eventually run out of other people's money to spend. Keynesianism is a controlled money redistribution, simply said, from rich to poor. You give the people money, the average massful of people, and they spend it on consumption, thus stimulating the economy. So the government should, like a sort of Robin Hood, take it from the rich and give it to the poor, all to keep the consumption running. The result has been a continual rise of public debt to the point where the entire Western states, the entire countries now stand on the brink of collapse. The debt amassed by this welfare system will soon reach its limits. Though one may argue that the government was only one-sided in its Keynesianism. They gave the poor, but they failed to take it from the rich, and the result are debt. Neoliberalism, on the other hand, failed visibly too. In fact, the current crisis, both in the USA and Europe, if it proves anything, it is that neoliberalism failed. Free markets did evidently not regulate itself. It is one of the ironies of the entire matter. What the crisis since 2008's collapse of Lehman Brothers and the ever-deepening crisis, bank after bank had to be saved by taxpayers' money. Market did not regulate itself. We can assume this idea clearly did not work. But do we see people turning their backs on neoliberal ideology? Not at all. On the contrary, it remains the dominant ideology among economists. The reality is that we never really had free market to begin with, because the very idea is flawed. We have systems in our modern speculative economy where someone can profit by betting on someone else's ruin. We do not, as in the days of early capitalism, just invest in some business like creating a factory that creates shoes or cars or computers. We have an unbelievably speculative market which has close to no connection to the real market at all. We have a huge, uncontrollable beast of banking, speculation and casino capitalism. Now, this entire system of modern economy has reached a complexity and size which simply is beyond our imagination. Literally. Even our many experts can hardly agree over anything, and anyone who begins to read about the day-to-day news and the outlines of our modern-day economy will soon understand that apparently even our most brilliant economists seem to be overwhelmed by the task to understand our crisis, let alone remedy it. Now, it is not only the average Joe and Jill which doesn't understand economy anymore. Even our representative politicians apparently fail to understand most of the things going on. Anytime some investigative journalists try to get some answers from politicians about the laws they decide on the basic ideas of banking, speculation and economy, it becomes painfully visible that the politicians in our parliaments don't know and understand most of it either. So we live in a democracy where the masses don't understand heck about the economy, which vote on politicians who don't understand heck about the economy, or themselves listen to the bankers and economists who by and large are responsible for the crisis we are in. But politicians ask the frauds how to deal with the issue of fraudulence. To sum this entire issue up, our economy has developed way beyond what the slow and cumbersome mills of democracy can overview, let alone handle. Economic processes in our days are fast, global, and extremely complex. They simply overwhelm the intellectual capacity of the average citizen as well as most politicians and overburden all our democratic regularities and customs. That is the bitter truth we face in our day. To get back the democratic control, we would need to make such a deep cut, such a fundamental revolution, which of course could happen. But that is something I regard as highly unlikely. We would have to break our own most fundamental ideology, the idea to always move forward, to ever expand. We would need to limit ourselves, our own most powerful forces, and such a castration of great powers is something only powerful upheavals like the French Revolution from 1789 have managed to realize. Now, while we see an escalating situation as in Greece or Spain, the masses are quite aware of the negative development. The fact that our democratically elected governments more and more serve bankers and speculators than following the will of the people or working for the people's benefit, there is no visible consensus or direction or vision of what else should come. This is not the October Revolution in Russia orchestrated by the left power. This is indeed more before 1789, where the French people, unknowing their direction about the fact that they wanted to get rid of the king, didn't have any coherent vision or plan, and the result were years of terror and decades of Napoleonic imperialism. France took 100 years to find its own form. Given the complexity of today's issues, we would need a reset of gigantic dimensions, and that in turn would need a conscious and outspoken relinquishment of consumption and prosperity. It was this overheat drive of capitalism and limitless growth that gave us long rise of prosperity, but the long overdrive mode has now damaged the engine itself, and whether we continue to run in overdrive until it breaks or consciously limit ourselves remains the question. I highly doubt that pampered masses have any mental minds that really renounce their consummation habits. The basic instinct of modern man is that of entitlement. We feel entitled to all our wishes, whims and all our private preferences and desires. This is the main difference between the people of the past era and the modern days. The people of the past were used to the idea of renunciation. Life was a limited, hindered and dangerous thing from all sides, both nature and civilization. There was a strict social order which was unchangeable. It was given. There were lords and servants. Society was in a strict hierarchy, and everything and everyone had a place and a social connection. The large family clan, the village, the landlord, the guilds, all these were bonds as strong and as self-evident as to the people as the sunrise. Also due to the lack of science and technology, people were in constant risk. Hunger, diseases, plagues, not to speak of the normal levels of war and violence in those days. Even for the rich and powerful people, life in the pre-modern era was dominated by limits, risks and austerity. People knew that there were always limits, and in that way they had cultural norms. Today all such norms have been dissolved. There are no self-evident bonds anymore. Even the oldest and most primordial one, family, is disintegrating. People focus entirely on their own personal desires and wishes. It is highly likely that the mentality of present-day people has never less been able to deal with a fundamental crisis than we. Where our grandfathers and parents in the great crisis periods of the 1920s had some skills, both mental and as craftsmen, what are we capable to do? Back then people were used to deal with hardships, to live without luxury given by modern civilization. For us, power comes out of a socket in the wall and food comes from the supermarket. We have no mental recognition of what complex level of organization and dedication such a civilization demands, and of course the more complex a system becomes, the more vulnerable it is. If the present system would collapse even temporarily, most people would be mentally entirely incapable to deal with shortages of any sorts, let alone of craftsman skills in the broadest sense. Who still knows how to plant vegetables or to collect herbs? Who would have the stomach to butcher livestock? Most elementary skills are lost to the masses. Or how would we heat when most modern apartments, unlike the houses of the past, no longer have an oven or furnace where one could warm the room with fire and coal? We lack the ability to deal with a real crisis, and that is why a revolutionary situation would not be something we could or would create consciously, and which is very likely a majority of our Western society simply will not survive. We have no bounds that connect us, we have no we anymore. People are so self-centered. People would lack the very basic willingness to step back with their personal needs to create a sort of common good. We have no common culture, like a series of values or ideas which connect or unite us anymore, other than the egoistical personal self-realization of our wishes, and the tolerance that others can do so as well. We are not civilized people anymore. We are barbarians, primitive, who live in a civilized environment, an environment whose complexity we no longer understand or control. That is the given situation we face. Now from here on we can unfold two different perspectives. One thing is clear, however, for a multitude of reasons, our Western societies cannot and will not continue to exist as we know. That much is certain. The very foundation of our society model rests on a series of limited goods. First and foremost, the limitless economic growth. There is a plethora of reasons why this will and must come to an end. Second, humans are always getting more. This is a simple but all-important fact, and I may say probably the most dire threat to the civilization of prosperity. This threat looms somewhere on the fringes of our consciousness. We know there are more and more people on this planet, a planet with limited space and limited resources. The implications of these developments are grim, and that will in the long run, if not hindered and reverted, lead to the most drastic changes. People will fight over resources sooner or later, and that will greatly destabilize societies all over the world, some sooner, some later. But the impact will be globally, and gigantic migration movements are something Europe and America are both very familiar with. The migration of people in Europe between the 4th and 6th century changed the European landscape, and the movement of the European settlers to the American continent brought the demise of the Native Americans. Migration movements were great upheavals which changed entire continents, destroyed ethnicities and buried cultures. Even modern man has no guarantee to be safe from it, despite our dreamlike belief that the status quo of liberty, democracy, and Western culture are granted. The migration period in Europe was defined by the fall of the Roman Empire and the lifestyle of antiquity and 2 centuries of short-lived kingdoms and empires. A hallmark of such a change, like in the fall of the antique world, are always rapid changes, a society that has no time to settle, but exists for generation under two and is quickly replaced by a new one. Something we are very familiar since the rapid changes of the 20th century, and that may become much more dramatic in the future. Migration routes already undermined the cultural and national coherence in a sort of global mishmash man. The regional and national identities have shrunk, and especially in the third world, people become more and more. So the percentages between how many Asians and Africans exist on the globe compared to the white Caucasian is constantly shifting to the disadvantage of the white people. Given how unequal power, wealth and goods are distributed among the continents, it doesn't take much imagination where it may lead to. Now one thing seems to be clear. We move towards difficult times and most likely a huge series of crises from many fronts. We have a petroleum-dependent technology, we have limited goods for a growing humanity, we have constantly a more complex and more risky economy and the banking sector and the rising debt in essentially all nations. They have no mental or craftsman skills to cope with the many crisis scenarios. Now at this point, two possible results could be the case. The first would simply be anarchy, civil war, the disintegration of society into barbaric, uncivilized status of quasi-tribal regions. Humanity would, as a society, once again be in the states of warring tribes and the rights of physical power. The old society, with its functionalities and bureaucracies, would continue to exist for a while, a few generations, but it would gradually vanish the same way the institutions of the Roman Empire vanished during the migration period. In the end, we would be in the same situation of Europe in the early Middle Ages. Tribal societies would slowly and over centuries restructure like these feudal realms, bound by no other identity than being subject and follower of a lord or a sovereign. The second alternative seems to be more plausible and most likely, however, and that is the one I will elaborate about. The trends and lines are already visible, so I think it is not difficult to project them. First, I found a long and profound collapse back to a tribal situation unlikely. The powers that be are most aware of the dangers than the masses and the mass media. I assume the masses are on purpose not informed of the real dangers we face in society, simply to avoid the panic reaction that may create the very collapse they try to avoid. Insofar it makes some sense from an inner perspective, not to tell the entire truth how dangerous our situation really is. If you follow news about the developments in terms of civil rights, governmental control, police and so forth, you see that more and more states actually prepare for a change, for a more stern control in the threat of disintegration developments. In the USA, this is most visible in politics like homeland security, police drones and a plethora of new laws. In Europe, it is a more subtle and maybe the European governments are mostly not mentally ready to face the final reality of how quickly a crisis may crush the coherence of society itself. On the background of fascism, they shirk away from the idea of police action. Though if you watch the police reactions in Spain recently or even in Germany in the Stuttgart 21 protests last years, you see that the police apparently is quite ready. The question is now, where does it all lead to? I think the answer is simply to a new age of Neo-Feudalism and New Imperialism. From my point of perspective, I see democracy and the liberal society as a past model, a temporary solution in a brief period of time. Democracy has always only and really worked in a limited setting. Democracy needs a safe, stable and prosperous society, and it always fell when these premises vanished. In a risky and dangerous society where scarcity is the rule and not the exception, democracy is too weak to deal with the problems. We already see that the times of continual prosperity and safety are past. We see that the complexity of all spheres of reality is getting too big to be under the slow mills of representative parliament, with the habits and procedures we take for granted, habits and procedures which stem from the 19th century. Insofar, I see the European Union already becoming a proto-empire, a sort of new world order en miniature. Especially in the face of scarce resources, global imperialism will become imperative for the Western forces. And the pattern is already visible. As the economic crisis unfolds, individuals and institutions are forged all under the pretense to fight the crisis, which more and more undermine democratic control and constitutional laws. The idea of a constitution, a basic law codex of rights and obligation, equal for all people and unchanging, was one of the greatest accomplishments of civilization. It was fought for hard and long. The very idea that people of a nation have all the same rights and duties was such a fundamental and profound change compared to the long night before modern civilization that the modern men just do not appreciate this enough. And this lack of appreciation has even reached the political class. What we see is a more and more common notion that a constitution is more a hindrance, a burden in the fast-changing times and in the crisis. Politicians, courts and people are getting more and more willing to see a constitution as something negotiable. In the past days of feudal lords and monarchs, the sovereign was not the people. It was a feudal lord, a prince. I am the state. L'État c'est moi. That said Louis XIV, King of France. And today we see the formation of a new feudal caste, not only as clearly visible yet, and not as ruthless. If we see how the first European aristocracy was formed, we see the later aristocracies first had been brigand leaders and robber barons, or simply gang leaders. Now there wasn't much money to steal in the Middle Ages, and in the agrarian society of the medieval era the currency was land. So the nobility of the Middle Ages took control of the land, since at that time people were bound to the land, and to control the land controlled the people. Much unlike in the antique world, which was a city society where currencies existed and people owned people directly as slaves, in the Middle Age period people were ruled via land ownership. Now in the modern era the importance of land and the agrarian sector has vanished, and since the early 20th century when the gold binding of the currencies were cancelled and a mere fictitious paper money was created, those who control the paper money control the people. We don't have real riches now like gold or land, we have only virtual riches. And what we see is that the control over the money is rapidly moving away from the democratic elected governments towards bankers and the international financial giants. They are as much a proto-aristocracy as the robber barons were proto-nobility of the Middle Ages. They will develop into a Neo-Feudalism. Sure, this will take time. It will not come overnight, even so some drastic changes regularly come in a crisis which accelerate the process. The angle of the race to power is based on the fear and the realization that our democratic habits are too weak to cope with a complex reality. At least that will be the legitimization or belief code which transport the idea and make it plausible and acceptable. A society and a political system is in the end always relying on the legitimacy, and that is a matter of make-believe. A system exists if it can create and stabilize the belief that it is a right, a given order that functions and that all alternatives are worse. Now, if you study surveys in recent years, you can see that the esteem of democracy, capitalism as free market, political parties, elections and so forth have continually dropped. People losing their belief in these, because the people feel more and more that the complexity of the system, the complexity of their lives has gotten too big for them to decide. If you ask people about any important question of our days, what you now get is, I don't know. People are clueless, and in a nihilistic time as ours, when no longer ideals, social layer, religion or culture give answer, people start to lose faith in their own thinking, their own votes, their own judgment, and most important in the system of democracy itself. Of course, the transition towards a new feudal system will be slow and mostly hard to see. It won't be for a certain time a clear break with the past. Like every coup d'etat, such a change of constitution will always highlight A, the necessity and lack of alternative due to the crisis, and B, the continuity towards the old. A neo-feudal Europe and America will do the same. They will claim how this is necessary and unavoidable due to a crisis, and how it is a good and logical continuation of the past. Communism and fascism argue just the same way, as did Augustus the First Emperor in the transformation of the Roman Republic to the Roman Empire. Only in hindsight, or the long distance, we see it as a break, which it actually is. The idea of constitutions will in the end become obsolete, and we will fall back to a regime of simple edicts. As monarchs in the past ruled from case to case, just giving edicts about single issues, not binding themselves in any way, so will the oligarchy of the future do away with constitutions, either by abolishing them or undermine its functions to the bare minimum, and under the banner of realistic pragmatism, civil rights will be a matter of the past, all in the name of reason and progress, of course. I have little doubt that this monetary elite and the technocracy will develop into the same sort of aristocracy with all its mannerism like the so-called nobility of the Middle Ages. Clandestine power hierarchies, pompous symbolism, and great pathos make the loyalty of the subjects plausible. While the democracy is defined by simple form, the hallmark of any aristocracy has always been pomp and pathos, and the neo-feudalism of the European Union and the USA will be just the same. Rational simplicity of participating citizens of the democratic nations will again be replaced by a fallback into the emotive loyalty towards a feudality, a group of sovereigns. Like the people of countries like Habsburg, Austria-Hungary, or the Holy Roman Empire, people will have no national citizenship, but they will be mere subjects of a lordship or a fiefdom. And the more hollow and weak such a mere belonging via confession is, the more pompous it celebrates itself. Already the European Union and the Euro protagonists have all signs of a sect or a religious cult. Critics are treated as heretics. The system as itself immunized against critique, branding all critics. That is the very opposite of a liberal, open and democratic society where there must always be choice and alternative. On the contrary, a large consensus of all major political parties already supports the new axioms of politics of no alternatives and all for the people, nothing through the people, and have done all sorts of tricks to outmaneuver all approaches towards more and direct democracy. The politicians and the technocrats are united in the perception that the issues of modern society are becoming too complicated to let people decide about it. That is the dominating attitude of the political case toward the people. Essentially, politicians despise the people. They are still dependent on their whims and wishes. They do not want to study the matter, that they have a say in anything, and the masses have proven to be a very moody mistress. It is this sort of contempt which unconsciously dominates the larger part of our political caste in our days, since most of them today are professional politicians. They are not citizens which happen to go into politics. They choose politics as a profession, as a job, and such a change must always mean the end of representative democracy. Simply said, they are no longer one of us. And if the new feudal and proto-imperial structures prove to get a grip on the crisis, or at least stem the tide, for a large part of people it will become legit over time, until they come to see democracy, the rule of the people, by the people, for the people, as a childish error of a past age, with the same hubris as we see all doings of the past as errors of foolish eras. The grand future of humanity one day going into space may very likely not be so much like Star Trek, but more a galactic or Terran empire as the Traveller universe shaped it. It is the foolish thoughtlessness that we take liberties and democracy and prosperity for granted that endangers the civilization we did not create, but we just inherited from stronger and better people, people shaped in the struggles and fights of a harsh and endangered life, people with character and ethics. The rollback has unfortunately already begun.